an Unspoiled Network podcast.
This is Spoil Me, covering Goldenhand Chapters 17, 18, 19, and 20, right? And 21 and 22. In these chapters, I understand the Claire's position here, but I really feel for Lirael coming back thinking that they're going to be like cooperative and treat her a certain way, and they just don't. And honestly, that shit was just like unnecessary, man. Come on, Claire. What are y'all doing over there? It was disappointing. I'm not angry. I'm just disappointed. Welcome to Spoil Me. Welcome to the show, everyone. I am Natasha. First of all, thank you very much to Yama for commissioning this episode. I am really so there are a couple of things about the coverage of this book that I want to talk about. The first thing is, I know that you guys all warned me not to do the audiobook because it's really bad, but I, at times, do not have a choice and really need to listen while I am doing something because I am pressed for time or whatever. So I got it. And I will just say, if you don't have to, I would really recommend not. The audiobook narrator for this book it's not just that she's not good at it, because she certainly is not doing voices. She's not really, but there's more of a feel to her that she might be an alien, because she just inflects bizarrely and puts an emphasis on words that don't really need or deserve it within the sentence, and then does not emphasize words that are actually like hugely important or even italicized. It's a weird read that was highly disconcerting, and I am going to do my best to make the time to physically read this myself if I can, because I felt there were times where I was so distracted by how much of a weirdo she sounded that I wasn't even hearing the words she was saying exactly. Secondly, I am a little bit concerned at how far we are into this book. This is episode 4. And how little has happened yet. We already saw Lirael rescuing Nicholas and, in The Creature in the Case. I understand that the author wrote The Creature in the Case separately, so he didn't necessarily go into this knowing this was going to feel like repeat information to the reader if they didn't read the ancillary material. But because I already knew that had happened and had seen most of that, the actual journey and the awkwardness between her and Nicholas can only fill up so much time. And by the end of this section, she has only barely been allowed into the glacier. It takes a long time. And I understand that that is meant to be part of the point, is that they are kept waiting and that she's nervous about it and she feels like she's made a bad impression on Nick and everything. But I am getting to a point where the whole thing is that she feels like they can help, and there have been 3 sections since the official rescue of Nick, and we haven't even really begun to approach what the hell is going on with him or that investigation. And I guess my question is that, like, I have been assuming that Goldenhand is part of another trilogy, and I realized that I don't actually know if that's true. And I didn't want to look at titles or anything, because sometimes there can be things that are sort of inadvertently spoilery. But if y'all out there are listening and you feel like it is safe to give me that information, please do. So I'm just sort of like hoping that by the end of this book, we at least have started to like really figure that out, and that this doesn't get drawn out much more, because I'm beginning to get a little impatient. I mean, by the end of this section, I have passed the halfway mark in the book, and it just doesn't feel like much has happened. The only, exception to that is Ferin. And with Ferin, I don't have the same connection. I like her character, and I'm interested in what's going on with her, and this whole thing with the witch with no face is like really interesting and compelling. And I'm honestly really glad to see that, oh my God, Clore. I'm really glad to see that Clore as a character is like being brought up again, because she was a really interesting villain. But I do not have the same like excitement about what's going on with Ferin, because I feel like the whole thing with her is getting to the Claire. And so I just really want her and Lirael to like meet up. I'm like dying for that, and I think I'm maybe just a little impatient. So that's the problem at times with covering something the way that I do, one section at a time, is that if you are absolutely tearing through a book because you're reading it on your own for fun, you aren't going to have the same kind of problems that I run into when I'm doing something a bit at a time. And it was part of what was, when I covered Twilight with Miles, it was really evident how little happens in those books, because it felt like so drawn out. And I realized as we were covering it, that's why I read them so quickly, was because there was a lot of skimming happening because so little happened. So I'm just curious, because I actually had this happen with a different book that I covered recently, where I reached the end of the book and I was like, what? That's it? Like, it just felt really abrupt, and it felt like not a lot happened, and it maybe didn't even need to be a full book's length of content. And now I'm sort of beginning to wonder, is it me? Or do other people feel this way? Is this something that or am I being too harsh? I don't know. Or do you guys agree with me? I'm just curious to hear y'all's opinions. So, and I do really appreciate everybody being super supportive of me moving these recordings to a little bit earlier, or to a little bit later in the day. But it does bum me out that there aren't as many people to help me out in the chat because of the time difference. And I do miss you guys. So I just wanted to let you know that I miss you all. All right. So let's get into 17. First of all, I've said before on other shows, and I will say it again, the word scuttle for the description of a movement is extremely unsettling to me. And when this wood weird is described as scuttling, I was like, ooh, no, I don't like that. Then we get the fucking description of the thing. This is basically a wood spider. Like, it's so fucking... Okay, I'm going to read this. This particular free magic construct was long and low, rather like a cockroach or spider in shape, one made from a rough-hewn hickory trunk and branches, trailing strips of partially sloughed-off bark. The creature had 8 legs made from tree roots, joined in multiple segments. Free magic fire burned at the joints and also in the eyes and the mouth that had been gouged in the end of its central trunk with auger and adze. It was very quick, faster than any wood-weird Ferin had seen before, as swift as a galloping horse, though it moved in a series of long lunges with short pauses in between. Well ahead of its fellows, it got down into the valley within a few minutes. There it continued its horrible, speedy, scuttling movement, rushing forward, stopping for a moment as if to test the air, then rushing forward again. I don't know how this motherfucker keeps on coming up with such upsetting creatures. He really does. There is one creature that I think might beat the things that he has, and it's in Dresden Files in a later book that we'll eventually get to. So I won't talk about it here. But these are, I mean, Garth Nix feels like he is really at the top of the list in terms of like creature design being, if you teamed him up with like Guillermo del Toro, I feel like they would have some insane, very, very unnerving project that they worked on together. So they're climbing up the hill, Ferin and her companions. I almost called them friends. That doesn't really apply. They're described as companions here, and I guess that is the most appropriate. You know, they're here to like back her up, but they don't know her. They're not really friends. They're colleagues, allies. They stopped to look down, and there was a collective pause in everyone's breath as the Woodweird did not turn aside to follow their path, but continued down the road following the fleeing villagers. The last dozen or so of the fisherfolk were still in sight, well short of where the road turned behind the southern hill toward the estuary and tower. And reminder, when I first was reading this, I had forgotten that the point was they were trying to lure it over to them. And when it doesn't follow them, I was like, oh, okay, good. And then I was very quickly reminded, no. That's what they want. That's what they're after here. Which just the idea of wanting this horror show to follow you does not compute. But, you know, I understand, but like, no, I don't. So more of them appear at the crest of the hill. And everybody's starting to get really nervous because that first one is traveling so fast. There's no way that these villagers are getting away. And the ones that are coming after, I mean, they just need to be slowed down by the first one, and they're all going to be ripped up. And Ferin is like wondering how this is even possible. And I thought this was actually really interesting. Ferin wondered at the profligate use of the Woodweirds so far from the steppe. The cost in sorcerers, keepers, and rare timber was extreme. She had said the raider must carry the sorceress' strength of 2 clans at least, but perhaps it was nearer 3 or even 4 clans working in concert at the behest of the witch with no face. Her own Athask people had only 2 shamans and 3 witches, and of them, only the most senior could create a Woodweird. It took years to make the body, carving the timber and infusing it with spells, preparing it for habitation by a powerful enough free magic spirit, which had to be gotten from wherever the sorcerers found such things. So that is really interesting. You know, I'm always into the logistics behind a thing. And the idea that it takes that long to make them, there's something simultaneously reassuring about that, because it doesn't feel like, oh, if you tear one apart or you manage to stop one, they can't just stop and conjure a new one up from wood laying around. It's apparently gonna really cripple them, but it does make it also more satisfying when they are able to take one down, because it really does fuck them up. So, you know, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. I see them as sort of like a car almost, where it's like, you know, it's not the end of the world, but like it is a fucking serious setback. So the 8-legged creature is following the fisher folk, and they're sort of like finger crossing that it's going to turn aside and begin to follow them. And eventually Laska decides that she has a way to get its attention a little bit. The borderer blew out a tiny breath, and Ferin watched in fascination as glowing marks tumbled from young Laska's lips and gathered in her hands, winding together like a tiny serpent, the head gripping the tail. She took another breath, deeper this time, laid her hands flat, and blew the spinning circle of marks out into the air. Rather than tumbling down the hillside, the glowing ring shot up into the sky, and a second later exploded into dozens and dozens of brilliant small stars that fell a dozen feet before disappearing with attendant thunderclaps, not loud and close, but as if from a far-off storm, which is a pretty neat trick. And the Woodweirds turn in their direction, indeed, and Ferin stands up and basically gives the Woodweirds the finger. And I really like that Laska knows precisely what it is that she's doing, because she thinks that this is just like something from the steps that is a rude gesture that other people aren't going to understand. But apparently, Laska says that they were assigned to the Northwest Desert for a few years. There are several oases there where the Moon Horse clan and Blood Horses come to trade, so I know a little of the tribes, and even of sand swimmers, woodweirds, and spirit walkers, though I confess to having seen a woodweird only once before. They were very uncommon in the desert. I think that the idea of sand swimmers is pretty cool and also, again, unnerving. The image that pops to mind, of course, is like the, sandworms from Dune, but with more legs, I guess is really what, like, I picture it as being kind of like a centipede. But maybe that would be more of a hindrance than anything. I don't know. I wonder if we'll see one. I wonder if these books ever do go up north and allow us to actually see these lands, rather than it just be something that is described to us this way. Because I would be very excited about including some of the wider world in this. It's fine to handle it this way. I'm not criticizing, the way that it's just sort of talked about. But it does sound very different from the world that we have seen so far. And so much of fantasy has a really, like, pseudo-European feel, the lands. And I'm always game for fantasy that tries out other locations a little bit. And it can prove not within the purview of the writer. It can expose some racism sometimes, or just ignorance. But sometimes it can turn out really well and be awesome. So I don't know. I'd be interested to see more of this land. So they head up the path, and it's getting harder and harder to climb, which on the one hand is a good thing, because it will really slow the Woodweirds down, because they aren't, they are not as ready to climb things like this as a person is. And the adjustment is not as easy for them. So they had gone on 100 paces when young Laska stopped and held her hand up to test the breeze. Winds changed, westerly now from the mountains, not natural. And they realized that, like, there was a wind eater on the ship that Ferin tried to shoot, but she did not kill. And they look up, it says they look back and saw the speeding Woodweird get its two leading tree root legs over the top of the steep climb, scrabble for a moment, then haul itself up on the ridge. So here comes them shooting and trying to, like, they don't have the spirit arrows. Is that the one? Is that what they're called? Well, I'll get to that in a minute, because somebody else actually has one. The Woodweird, like, they get it through the eye sockets, and it seems for a moment that maybe that did it, but it just starts moving again, and it becomes pretty clear that all that did was blind it, but it's not actually, like, mortally injured or anything like that. So her next arrow missed the other leg, striking shale, and the creature rushed forward, opening its rough-cut mouth wide, the fire within roiling, white smoke jetting forth, accompanied by the nauseating hot metal reek of free magic. So we cut from there back to the glacier. And Lirael is getting really irritated. Quilla, who is the new acting lieutenant, doesn't feel like she has the authority to put the sending back under the stones. Reminder, it's like this giant centipede, or it's a specific type of, like, worm, drill grub, that's right, that has been sort of standing over them, being extremely threatening and really freaking poor Nick out. Like, he's just not used to this shit in general, the idea of sendings. But also, this is a creature that's just terrifying. And it has been made more terrifying because somebody has decided to have a little fun with it. So I was relieved to hear that Nick is not only no longer standing there staring at this terrifying creature, but he's been also given clothing and sent back to the paper wing to stay warm. Good. Because he's really not doing super well. Nick is like shaking, and it's not because he's cold. He's lost a lot of blood. And I'm really like, when I said at the start of this episode how disappointed I was, that really was the thing, is that there is a person here who is obviously injured and in need of help. And while I definitely understand the need for caution in general, you can't just like anybody who says, I'm injured and I need help. You can't necessarily help everybody because they aren't always telling the truth. And you do have to be cautious. But when it comes to a guy who's been accompanied by somebody like Lirael, I really was unimpressed with the Claire putting up any sort of fight about this. Like, come on, guys, you know? It just feels really political and sort of like a coward's stance on a thing. Even though, to a point, I understand the taint of free magic upon him being an obstacle. You know, and granted, they do come up with a way around this, but it takes more fighting from Lirael than I feel like it really should. Lirael asks, can someone send for Mirelle or the voice of the 9-day watch? And Quilla starts to say, I don't think this calls, and starts to deny even involving another person. Quilla, what do you intend to do? Just stand there and stare at each other? Bitch, get shit done. What are you doing? And Lirael has to be like, I actually liked it. Quilla, said Lirael, I know it's hard for you all to come to terms with the fact, but I am not just some junior cousin anymore. I am the Abhorsen in waiting. If it was Sabriel here asking you to let her guest in, would we all be standing around in the cold? No, said Quilla, but get Mirelle, said Lirael, or the voice. Quilla looked as if she was about to say something, but shut her mouth as Lirael looked at her, her golden hand resting on the handle of Sereneth, the 6th bell, the one used to bind the dead to the wielder's will. There was no trace of the meek, withdrawn girl Quilla had known vaguely by sight, as all the Clare knew one another, if not better because of her closer kinship, or the propinquity of either work. What? I didn't even notice that word the first time. Hold on, I'm Googling this because I don't know that word. Propinquity, the state of being close to someone or something. Proximity. Just say proximity then. Just say that. Why are we using this word? That's a bonkers word. I'll send word for Mirelle, said Quilla, and walked away to confer with one of the other rangers. So, yeah, I just really, I do understand Lirael being preoccupied a little bit with the fact that, this looks bad to Nick. Of course I understand that, because there is nothing like reassuring somebody that you know what to do, that it's going to be okay, that you kind of have an in somewhere with a person who can help. And then for that alleged connection to kind of laugh in your face in front of the other person, I mean, that's just a blow to your ego, whether or not you are romantically interested in the person involved in the situation with you or not. And considering that she is into Nick, all the worse. And also, yeah, I feel like this is just another, not taking Lirael seriously. I appreciate that Quilla looks at Lirael and is like, oh, she doesn't look like the little girl she did. But also, who cares what she looks like, dude? The right thing to do here seems pretty fucking obvious to me. Even if you don't know that you can make the call, go get somebody to deal with it, man. This is like classic frustration with like working with other people, where you will hear a person lower down on the ladder of authority telling a customer no about something that is just really, it's obviously like a small thing that they're feeling a little bit petty about. So they're saying no, even though it's absolutely doable. And they didn't even ask you, a manager, whether or not you could do it, because there's a feeling to that as if they don't want to do it. They don't want to hear you say yes, and they might know that you will say yes. And they just kind of feel a way about the customer that they're helping, and they don't want to help them. And that's sort of the vibe that I got from Quilla, is that I feel like she doesn't want to help Lirael. And she's sort of hiding behind this like, oh, well, you know, this is above my pay grade, and anyway, you don't fit the criteria, so sorry, there's nothing I can do. How much effort does it take to get somebody else involved? And literally, what do you think the others are going to think of you if they hear you sent Lirael away and never even asked them for their advice on the situation? There's this sort of like very short-term thinking here of like the satisfaction of sending somebody away that shouldn't be outweighed by the overall consequences of the inevitable moment other people find out what you did. I just think that she's really not thinking this through at all, and it took so long. And Lirael is like pretty furious, and she is trying to keep her cool. She's trying to, in front of Nick especially, can keep projecting this like air of confidence that it will be fine. And for his part, Nick he says something about how this is like the same kind of bureaucracy as back home, and that he really thought maybe here it would be different, but they're facing the same obstacles that they would where he's from. And it's nice. It's him trying to like reassure her that he understands how this shit works and he knows how this can be. And I really do appreciate him like saying that and just trying to ease her mind a little bit. But I just was 100% with Lirael in terms of her like irritation about the whole thing. And it says, and though she didn't want to admit it even to herself, she had hoped that when she did eventually return to the glacier, she would finally be treated as someone of note, a handsome frog rather than an ugly tadpole as in the children's story, which I imagine is like our story of the ugly duckling, which turns into the beautiful swan. Morel arrived some 30 minutes later, slightly out of breath from running up the Starmount stair, something that would have left most Claire half her age, or anyone else for that matter, puking and half dead. I don't remember this. I don't know if this was like mentioned in the other books and I have simply forgotten, but the stairs are like described in a way that makes me feel like there was something else living here before they got here, because it says the steps had higher rises than normal and were built for, as if they were built for a race of 8-foot tall people, which had me immediately going, were they? Because there's nothing that's out of the question in this series, or so I feel. So Morel asks Lirael to touch her mark, and Lirael like, there's a part of her that's like, I know that this is how traditionally you are meant to greet each other. And so this doesn't look particularly out of place. But she has a real suspicion that it's not about the traditional greeting. They are not sure about her. And it turns out a little bit later that Morel says, we didn't see you coming. We didn't normally, when we are going to get visitors, we 100%, because that is something that directly involves us, get warning of it with our site, but we didn't have it with you. And so we're all sort of worried about whether or not you are who you say you are and who you look like you are. So again, I understand that caution. That is a valid thing. But the fact that it took so much arguing to just get somebody to come over and test Lirael out and explain to her that that's part of the caution just irritates me. And she comes over and touches Nick's mark. And Lirael explains before she does that, you know, whole situation with Nick and the fact that he has been sort of contaminated, tainted by free magic. Now you touch my mark, she said. That is the normal courtesy. We do it to assure ourselves the mark is not faked or corrupted in some way. So Nick does it, and he feels that like pull, which other characters have gotten used to by now because they've done this, but he has never felt before. And it's really a neat description every time it happens. I'm just going to read this. Nick gasped as he felt himself suddenly surrounded by glowing charter marks, the normal world somehow dull and removed. He knew he still sat in the paper wing. He could feel the cool air, but at the same time he had the sensation of sinking. No, diving. Deep into some other space, an endless sea of glowing charter marks that had no beginning or end. And he became afraid that he would be lost in it as he began to feel separate from his own body, a detached intelligence caught up in this rushing current of magic, and he had to exert all his willpower to pull his fingers back, breaking the connection and restoring himself to himself. And I really enjoy when he comes back and he thinks about how small and insignificant he feels. That has been the last remaining frustration for me with Nick, is how he, even when faced with so much evidence of magic around him, has still sort of tried to exert authority in situations when he doesn't know anything about it. And when you are somebody who is used to being in charge or used to being like the only competent person, it can be really hard when you are faced with a situation you genuinely don't know anything about, because the instinct is still to try and take charge. That doesn't necessarily go away, even if logically you know that's not really the right move for you here, or right move for anyone else. So I'm hopeful that this connection with the charter that he has here will lead to him being a little bit less bossy, or at least sort of like second guessing of Lirael as he has been, because it has felt that there are occasional things that he keeps questioning her on as if he doesn't trust her judgment. And I've just been like, dude, she lives here. You don't know anything. Shut up and just let her do her thing. So at this point, Morel says the free magic causes a problem. We can't allow you entry as a visitor. And she says it in this way that Lirael hears there's a loophole in her voice. The way she's saying it, she's clearly trying to lead them to some conclusion. But Lirael doesn't understand. She figures it out a little bit later, but at the moment she does not understand what this lady is trying to get at here. So she asks who the voice is right now, and if the voice could overrule the prohibition. And Morel is like, okay, the voice is your aunt right now, which really shocks Lirael. And so we find out that what happened is that a bunch of the people who would normally be in the watch and would be a potential to be the voice, which apparently only it's like a couple weeks assignment, I think. All of them have come down with the flu, and this means that they are pulling people in who don't normally have this sort of like, I hesitate to call it a military role because it feels not quite accurate, but it's certainly something that's a little bit more active than what they had been doing with defenses. So Lirael knew that sometimes when everything was quiet and there wasn't much being seen anyway, the post was assigned to those worthy in other ways as a mark of distinction and gratitude for their everyday work in the glacier. So, the problem here, as Lirael says, is that Kirith, who is they keep calling her aunt Kirith. I don't remember if she is actually related to Kirith or if that's just like a sort of affectionate term. It's kind of funny to say that because she doesn't even really like Kirith. It says she did not hold a high opinion of her aunt Kirith's intelligence. Worse, Kirith was deeply suspicious of anyone or anything from outside the Clare's closed world. She would never overrule any tradition, regulation, or even old habits of the Clare. Ayantu's here. She's her mother's sister. She is related to her. Okay, I couldn't remember. So this is when Lirael begins to think about the Stilken, which is a free magic creature and was somehow inside the library. And she's like, how did they have that fucking thing inside? And I can't bring my dying friend inside. What the fuck? And then realizes that she can basically treat Nick as a specimen to be studied. And in that way gets around the prohibition because he turns into kind of like a science project. And Lirael, meanwhile, is over there like kind of smiling because she wanted Lirael to figure this out and suggest it. I don't know if there's like a rule that Lirael couldn't really like present this idea herself, if there was a real reason why Lirael has to be the one to do it and not her. But whatever the case, Lirael, when she finally like comes to this conclusion, you can see that Lirael is really pleased. And let's see, Lirael helped Nick out of the paper wing and whistled 3 short, sweet notes. Charter marks leaping with her breath on the paper wing's nose. It shuddered and lightly flicked its wings. Lirael held Nick as they walked to the slowly opening gate, the paper wing drifting along behind them a few inches above the ground. Ayantu says, I'd be so upset by this if I was Nick. Now, that's an interesting question. And that was something that I wondered as well, is, does Nick take offense to this? And we saw earlier how her describing to him the fact that he is infected with free magic, he felt just that simple description of his situation was her essentially telling him that he is a problem that needs solving, that he's like trouble. And I can't imagine being treated as if you are an object, literally. I don't see that making the feeling of being trouble dissipate. I mean, just the actual trouble of trying to get in the building being as difficult as it was, I could see Nick really like feeling self-conscious about everything here. So we go back to the fight with the wood weird. I'm realizing that I am running out of time here. Swinther backed up. Go! I will slow it. Go! In answer, Ferin reached off the path, grabbed the corner of a slab of shale half her own size. Help me! Young Laska saw at once what Ferin intended. She picked up the other side of the stone. Duck! They shouted together, and as Swinther dropped low, they heaved the stone against the woodweir's already damaged foreleg. Once again, it did not affect the ensorcelled timber, but the stone broke into pieces and fell under the creature's questing forelimbs, making it pause for a dozen seconds as its long, root-like legs tentatively felt for solid ground amid the rubble. There is something about its root-like legs, that is hard to say, that I just think sounds really like creepy. And it's funny because with something like an Ent, it's fine. But with this thing, absolutely fucking not. So finally, this wood weird like slides and cracks down on like off of a cliff and is like covered in shale. And I assume that it's actually killed, and I put that in quotes because of the reaction of a shaman. It says, a shaman climbed up to the path, ignoring the keeper, who was heaving on the silver chain about his neck to keep him still. What in the hell is up with these keepers and shamans? This is really freaking me out. It seems like the shamans are simply slaves, I guess. The keeper climbed up behind the fallen shaman, knelt on his back, and jerked the chain savagely several times as a warning or to ensure compliance. Then she let go, dropped the chain, and stood up to take the bow from her back. This keeper is carrying some of those like spelled arrowheads because that is like a provision against the potential magic of these shamans. And it is a really weird situation to have them be a separate deal from like basically these shamans don't necessarily subscribe to the motivation of whoever is doing this. It's just that he is like forced to. He's like been drafted. And that is something I don't think we've seen before. Anybody who has been involved has been so either voluntarily because they are, ambitious or they're going to get something out of it. Or there's been like Nick who was enchanted into cooperating without realizing it. But this is a whole other situation. The shaman eventually gets shoved off of the edge of the cliff and just, that takes out one and there's 11 to go. And it's just the concept of this. I don't feel like I knew that's how this worked until this very graphic moment of like oppression happened. And I felt I felt unexpectedly sympathetic. So let's see. They look up and they realize that the clouds are beginning to come together. And they realize that maybe there's a necromancer out there for whom keeping the sunlight off the crowd will be quite an advantage. And I don't like that. I feel like that's just unfair. It shouldn't be like, I just feel like it should be something that like the earth knows that if the sun is up, these things just can't be out. Whether or not the sun is covered by clouds, the sun is up, you're out of play. That's how it should be. But evidently that is not how it works. So let's see. Yeah. The shadow of cloud roiled over them. He did not wear traditional garb, and it took Ferin a moment to work out that the off-white coat he wore was a kind of armor made from hundreds of small bones, linked with dark iron rings. It was almost certainly imbued with charms against ordinary arrows. The keeper behind him was a woman, and she has the spirit glass arrow. That's what it's called, spirit glass. Ready and waiting just in case because of this guy's fucking power. And Ferin asks Laska, hey, are there any dead buried up here? Because this guy, if so, is gonna really have an advantage on us. And Laska's like, not up here on the hill, but down there were like a dozen farms in the valley, and there was a feast, and nobody knows what happened, but they all started fighting, and nearly all of them were killed. Okay. I am dying to know what the fuck happened there. I really want to know if Garth Nix even knows what happened there. I could see this being something that, like, he didn't fully think through. He's like, I'm going to make this be some sort of legend, and I will come back to it, and we'll all talk about it later. And, you know, or not. But if he feels like coming back to it, he can build a story around the legend. The bodies were put into the ground. This is 54 years gone. And Ferin asks how many and how close. And Swinther says, well, they say hundreds. But, you know, that's the story. I don't know if that's true. And he says there are also those who have died along the ridge, one every few years or so. The farm boys will do it as a sort of initiation, and sometimes ours will join in. The fallen will be under the shale. The bodies can never be recovered. So then they have to be like, okay, well, where's water that we can put between us and them? And they are realizing that it's there's a tower and an estuary that is marked by this tower. And Swinther, interestingly, when facing down the wood weirds, didn't seem to be feeling like particularly worried. But as they are talking about the dead rising to attack, Swinther's starting to be real uncomfortable and has gotten pale and is beginning to sweat. So his words trailed off. There was no need to speak the ifs aloud, for there were too many. Night was coming early, and soon the necromancer behind them would be summoning the dead. So then we go to chapter 20, and Lirael is heading inside with Nick. She is unaware at this point that she's going to be given the Abhorsen's rooms, which is actually like a series of apartments. It's not even just like there are multiple rooms. We'll get to the description of it later, but that's pretty cool. I feel like that might go some way to making her feel a little bit better about the way she was greeted here. So there's this really kind of touching moment. Though she had rarely used the long stretches, walking in that particular charter light and feeling the unique, humid warmth provided by the steam pipes stirred up Lirael's confused feelings of both being home and not being at home. She had always felt something of an outsider here, but growing up had known nowhere else. Back then, she had never considered the possibility of living away from the glacier, or having a life that was not as one of the Clare. This had lasted right up until the final revelation that she would never have the sight, and instead had an entirely different destiny as an Abhorsen. Now she was experiencing what it was to return to the place of her childhood, where she had always desperately hoped she would one day permanently and properly belong. With it came the clear understanding that though this was her heritage, it was only that, something of her past that would not come again. She had become someone and something else, whose life and future lay apart from being one of the Clare. There is something so moving about that to me, because I feel like this is a thing, especially culturally, as the world starts to feel smaller, and people begin to marry and have children who are of two different races or two very different cultural backgrounds. As a child who is Hispanic and white, I had my mother's side of the family where everything was extremely traditional and very waspy. And then I had my father's extremely, like, family, the waspy thing isn't super family focused. It's very, like, classist. And my father's side of the family was much, much more interested in, like, community. But they all spoke Spanish, which I didn't. I learned it later and I wasn't fluent. And as much as they all wanted to make me feel a part of things, and I knew they were trying to do that, I never really felt like I was. I didn't always understand what was being said. I didn't always understand the significance of certain traditions because it was something that was new to me, whereas to my cousins, this was something they did every year because they were always here for these particular events and I wasn't. And as I've gotten older, the real like shock came when my father finally passed away, and I went to see my family because of the funeral, and started to realize that like I had always sort of had it in my head that as I got older, I would begin to like feel more at home with my family on my father's side. And I just realized that wasn't going to happen. I've moved away. I don't talk to them nearly as much as I ever did. Like, I mean, I didn't talk to them a ton before, but now that I've moved away, it's almost nothing. I have lost a lot of the Spanish that I learned, and my life has just completely changed and shifted. And there is a melancholy to that, to realizing that you, somewhere in your mind, you felt like you didn't belong, but you always had an expectation, an unconscious default expectation that you would fit eventually, that it would happen for you. It's just going to take some time. And then to turn that corner and realize that's not actually going to happen. And you aren't even necessarily upset that it's not going to happen, because you might be happy with where you are now, and I am. But that moment of realization and then having to let it go can be really startling in how much it bothers you, considering that it was not something you were continuing to even strive for actively anymore. It's surprising sometimes how much we get attached to a concept of how things are supposed to be. And even if it's not something we really want so much, it is in our head for so long that when it's gone, you don't know what to do with that blank spot now, you know? And it can just be sort of uncomfortable, even though it's not necessarily like heartbreaking or disappointing even, you know? It's just sort of like, oh, I guess that expectation was based on nothing, and now I have to sort of move past it. So she gets greeted by, you know, the deputy, or what do you call it? Not deputy, the delegation. That's the word I want. The delegation of all of these librarians. And she's remembering back when she had been an assistant librarian, being part of these sort of like ceremonial greetings, and how odd it is to be at the forefront and greeted this way herself. So Vencel comes forward, who is the head librarian, I think, and she hugs Lirael and says, "You have done great things, and all of us in the library are very, very proud of you." And I like this, that Lirael, as much as she's not one of the Clare, it says she still felt she was a librarian and always would be, no matter what else she had become as well. So I liked that distinction, that maybe she didn't get the sight, maybe the Clare are known for something else that she wasn't a part of, but there is a particular facet of living here that belonged to her and that she does identify with, and it's still there. So Vencel has these two boxes and is like, you know, we have gifts for you, but I can see that you're really tired, so maybe they can wait. She notices Nicholas and she knows about his role and the whole thing. And they are Lirael's thought is we can bring him to the infirmary. And Vencel is like, okay, the thing is, and we would, but it's full of people who have the flu right now, so we're probably going to have to keep him in your rooms. And this is when we get the description. 12 bedrooms at least, several sitting rooms, a very extensive bathhouse, all from the days when the Abhorsons were more populous, and a score or more might visit at the same time. Which is crazy to me, to think about the Abhorsons being so numerous. We have never been a part of this world when there are that many of them around. So it just is totally an alien idea to me. So yeah, she's like, okay, let's do that, but we definitely need a healer to come because I tried spells on him and it didn't really work. And Vincel says, okay, but I also have a lot of healing talent, so I will also look at him. And Vincel had ash gray hair and some powerful lines upon her face, but even so, Lirael did not think she looked any more than 65. However, she had to be in her 90s at least. Even this was not a great age among the Clare. Most did not take to their dreaming rooms until they were well past their century, and the majority didn't die for a few decades after that. Which is crazy. I don't think I remembered that was the case, that they can live for like 120 years. It's not, you know, like a 300-year lifespan, like in some, what's the word I want? Some other fantasy like world building where it's sort of a tripled system a lot of the time, but it's longer enough that it feels really kind of spooky and not so long as to feel supernatural. Exactly. So let's see. Lirael indicated the rangers to follow, and I liked this, that Lirael is explaining as they're walking about how everything worked. And she kind of realizes that she's babbling a little bit and doesn't really know if she should be sharing as much as she is. So she sort of clams up a little bit. And I found that interesting because it feels like maybe she doesn't entirely trust them. And I'm extremely curious about why that instinct overtook her there for a minute. So she gets to the rooms and she has to open them herself with her, you know, abhorsen hand, basically. And there are all of these sendings in there that are remaining after all this time. The reception room was not at all like Lirael's old, rather bare room in the Hall of Youth. There was a rich woolen carpet on the floor in deep blue with silver keys embroidered around the edges and an abstract but recognizable bell motif in the center. I really love the descriptions of the rooms and of the clothes. It's such an odd... And I think I've asked already what the deal is with the keys, but I don't think I got an answer. If you all can't answer me, that's fine. But I wonder why that's the symbol of the abhorsens. So let's see. Lirael tells Nick what's going on because he's been pretty much asleep for most of this whole thing. And Nick is sort of helped up and apologizes for appearing to Vincel in such a state. And I just really, there's something about him apologizing all the time when he is so injured and like really in bad shape that it makes me almost angry at him. Like, it's just so pathetic. Stop it, Nick. You know, I can do this. I don't want to be a burden all the time. You're not a burden, said Lirael, not without some exasperation. It will take a while to recover from your blood loss. She was still quite cross about the delay in getting inside, and would be crosser still if Nick ended up getting a cold. Or this influenza that was going around the Clare, which honestly I'm very suspicious of. The idea that everybody's having at the flu? I don't know about that. Seems suspicious to me. So Vincel says that she doesn't think he's in immediate danger. And I'll leave you to bathe. On my return, we can take a look at Master Sayer's wound and general state. And I love that she says to Imshi, do try and remember she is the abhorsen in waiting now and must be treated with great respect, not as someone to go and fetch your spare waistcoat because you've spilled tea on yourself. Yes, librarian, said Imshi, her eyes downcast. It was only the once, or maybe twice. And Lirael offered, didn't you? Imshi stopped talking because Lirael was chuckling and Vincel was already gone. I am like out of time and there's still chapter 21 to talk about. I think I will still read 50 pages for the next episode because gore crows are back, which are just the freakiest thing. This is such an action-packed chapter that there's not a whole lot to talk about happening here. Like because there's so much, it's just like, fight, run. But I'm going to wrap this chapter into the discussion for the next one and just kind of do a quick recap on it the next time. So hopefully y'all are okay with that. But yeah, I hope that you guys get where I'm coming from with some of my criticisms at the beginning of this episode. I'm interested to hear what y'all think. And I just really want Lirael to gain some confidence, and I don't know what that looks like or what could happen to cause that. So I'm rooting for her. She's so sort of like subdued, and I feel bad about it sometimes, But anyway, all right, I'm going to wrap up. Thank you again very much to Yama for commissioning this episode. Thank you, Ayantu, for being here in the chat, and I will see you all again soon with a new episode. Until then, toodaloo, motherfuckers.
That was an Unspoiled Network podcast.